Starting. All righty.
All right. So welcome to day 2 of the Fall 2024 Shawnee State University Faculty Research and Teaching Expo. Our first session for today is with Dr. Kurt Shoemaker. He's going to be talking about the floodwalls before the floodwall, Portsmouth, and flood defense prior to the 1936 Flood Control Act. Dr. Shoemaker.
Thank you. I don't know if you maybe want to zoom in on the slide a little bit. There's some lecturing from slides. I don't know that many people really get this view anymore. Obviously,
That's because the TV, I think.
Oh. Well, we can. Okay. Well, do this the old-fashioned way. There we go. So this is the Madison Front Street of Madison Floodgate. Obviously, this is the big flood wall. This is the old flood wall along Front Street. Alexandria Point would be out to the left here, and you see it from the Front Street side, and it's rib high, and you don't realize how impressive it is until you get down below it. This is a really substantial defense, and it's kind of dwarfed by the new wall with good reason. But the old flood wall is really significant, not just in Portsmouth's history, but in the history of flood defense in the United States. Almost all the things here. So, I don't know, a month ago, I was taking a walk, and this is just on the other side of what I showed you, and I saw that somebody had painted on the old flood wall here, that this flood wall was built after the 1913 flood, which is entirely incorrect. The lower part of it, so it's got this kind of cap on it here. So the lower part of it was built beginning in 1909, and then this top foot was added after the 1913 flood. So I'm not sure who painted this on there. I'm sure it was well intended, but I think it just underscores that when you talk about the history of a lot of things in Portsmouth, but flooding in particular, some of them have kind of passed into folklore. And, there's a kernel of fact behind it, but people just keep repeating stories that aren't entirely true. And I've really discovered this over the last year or so that I've been researching the history of flooding. So in terms of successful flood defense for Portsmouth, that history goes back about a decade before this wall was started. We'll just kind of get our bearings around here. A Google Earth view of Portsmouth. I've highlighted some of the main features here, and of course we can talk about the West End or Boney Fiddle, the historic North End, and the East End. A couple other places to point out. The far East End out here, the western end of the rail yards and the areas to the south. This was called Earlytown, and it was sort of a suburb of Portsmouth, really. Portsmouth, keep in mind that when Henry Massey platted Portsmouth, it only extended on Front and Second from Alexandria Point to Market. And as the city grew, it grew eastward and northward. But really, up to the end of the 19th century, Portsmouth grew pretty slowly. From about 1880 to 1930, the population of Portsmouth quadrupled. And so it's really at 1880 or so is when you really start to spread east and north and eventually up into the hilltop. So, you know, Chillicothe Street is kind of an important boundary. And then later on, Waller Street is kind of an important boundary as far as being the eastern limit of the city. So early town out here would have been considered like a suburb. Another named neighborhood is down here. The area basically Front and Mill Streets, east of Sinton, was called Slaptown. So basically our lower parking lot here at the university and the Shawnee Turf. As to the origin of the name Slaptown, Drew Fight thinks it's because there was a sawmill upriver, and when they would square the logs, they would discard the bark slabs. It kind of developed as a shanty town built out of these slabs. So that was Slabtown. And then, of course, Bony Fiddle is really, I think, the only one of these old named neighborhoods that's really persistent. So, first thing I want to do is just look at what happens when Portsmouth floods. So, when we talk about Ohio River floods at Portsmouth, the key number is 50 feet. 50 feet is considered flood stage for the Ohio River at Portsmouth. And that is 50 feet deep in the channel. So right now, even after all of the fun rain of the last couple of weeks, the Ohio's right at about 20 feet. And even, you know, in the aftermath of that big rainstorm a couple weeks ago, the Ohio really only came up about 4 feet. The flooding that we saw from that was really urban flash flooding as opposed to true river flooding. So without any flood defenses, what's going to get wet in Portsmouth at 50 feet? Not much. A little bit of the riverfront area. This is Doyle's Landing at the end of Faulkner Street. And then out here by Spartan Stadium. This is the historic mouth of Lawson's Run, which was called Funk's Gut, which is probably one of the coolest names in Portsmouth. Funk's Gut. Gut is an obsolete geologic term for a narrow waterway, and Funk was the guy that owned that land. We raised the water a little bit. You see we have a little more flooding out here at Earlytown, and oh, look at that, the lower parking lot at Shawnee Slaptown floods. This is 2.5 feet above flood stage. So, you know, it's no real surprise that our parking lot flooded the way it did the other day, because it's the second lowest point in the city. And in a storm like that, the sewers just can't keep up with it. Incidentally, am I the only person that remembers that the dorms flooded about 7 years ago? They did. So as the water continues to raise, notice we're getting more flooding in the east end, but the west end is staying dry. The original settlement at the mouth of the Scioto was Alexandria on the opposite bank. And that's very low ground. What made the Portsmouth site more attractive was because it was more flood resistant, because it was a little bit higher. We're at about 56 feet here, what is considered a moderate flood of 57 feet. We're getting close to that, and the west end is still looking pretty good. 59 feet now, and we finally are seeing some water in the west end along 3rd Street. 3rd Street is really low ground in the west end, and drainage on 3rd and 4th historically has been problematic. Going back to the earliest days in the city, I found an old reference that described the area of 3rd and 4th as being, quote, very bad and full of croaking frogs. There was, in the early 19th century, somewhere in the farthest part of the West End, a stream that was referred to as the Honey Gut that was used as an open sewer. And that contributed to some of the drainage problems along 3rd as well. But 3rd Street is going to be very important in our story today. Now we're up to 62.5 feet, and we see much more substantial flooding. We've got most of the far west end underwater, 2nd Street really up to Market, and some more extensive flooding in the east end as well. But we did have in the east end some high ground in between two flooded areas. And going to almost 66 feet. 66 feet is considered major flood. This puts an awful lot of the city below the hilltop underwater. I will point out, though, that there is this island in the east end, along a little bit of 3rd, a good chunk of 4th, and a little bit of 5th. This is east of Offner Street. And this was Rose Ridge. Levi York, who was Portsmouth's own steel baron, he was the president of the Burgess Steel Mill that was out at the far west end of 3rd Street. When it burned down in 1898, he rebuilt it in New Boston, and that was the beginning of the New Boston Steel Mill. But he had his mansion on 4th, on Rose Ridge here. So highest ground in the east end, and as far as protection from flooding, high ground is your friend. We go to 69 feet. Now we're in fully a major flood. There have only been 3 floods in Portsmouth history that have exceeded 66 feet, and there's very little dry ground below the hilltop at this point. Robinson Avenue skirts the south edge of the hilltop, and Robinson Avenue is going to have some significance here. 72 feet, and that is taking care of what little dry ground there was below the hilltop. And we're now at 75.5 feet. Now, the 1937 flood was 74.25 feet, and this gives you a very good idea of how much of Portsmouth was underwater during the 1937 flood. Our flood defense goes to 77 feet, though, and so that's 3 feet more than the 37 flood. Okay, I'm a scientist. I like graphs. And so these are the floods on record at Portsmouth that have gone above a stage of 57 feet. So flood stage is 50 feet. 57 to 66 feet is considered a moderate flood. And then over 66 feet is a major flood. And again, there's only 3 floods above 66 feet. 1884 at 66.3 feet. 1913 at 67.9 feet, and then way up here, 1937 at 74. Quite a few floods in the moderate range, and I haven't bothered to show any of the floods below 50 feet because they haven't really been of consequence in Portsmouth's history. Below 57 feet. Because those floods really haven't been of consequence. The historic part of Portsmouth in the 19th century, that is basically the West End, was high enough that these wouldn't really do anything but maybe wet a few basements. Outlying areas areas like Slab Town, we don't really have good records of what was going on there. And then once we start building flood defenses, those become inconsequential. So, going back to my second slide where I showed the old flood wall where it was painted that it was built in 1913 and it wasn't. I mentioned that the story of successful flood defense really begins about a decade before that. The first flood that Portsmouth successfully defended against was in 1898. This was through a system of emergency levees and dropping sandbanks in the sewers for the most part. The actual building of floodwalls commenced in 1909 with the 61-foot wall that extended from Alexandria Point to Chillicothe Street. In 1915, that was raised by a foot and extended to Offnear Street. And in 1930, it was extended all the way through the east end to where it joined the railroad levees of the Norfolk and Western. One more thing before I leave this. Most of our story is going to be concerned with what's going on here. 1897, 1936. Okay, so that 1897 flood. This is by accident, I suppose, the beginning of flood defense in Portsmouth. There had been a flood in 1832, a flood in 1847, and the response to it was pretty much, hey, what can you do? It's an act of God. Once the water drops, you mop up and you get on with it. You get to 1883, and you have another flood, and then in 1884, you have the first of the three major floods that hits Portsmouth. And by that point, 1884, Portsmouth is becoming pretty prosperous. It's starting to hit that growth boom. You've got a really diverse local industrial economy, and the civic leaders were beginning to brand the city as the peerless city. And 1884 comes, and it's disastrous. So jump up to the end of the 1890s, and really there hasn't been any thought given to how do we deal with future floods. So when the 1897 flood comes, they're basically caught with their pants down. The cool thing about the 1897 flood was what happened the year before. In the summer of 1896, the 3rd Street sewer collapsed. And because 3rd Street is low, the sewer had allowed water in to the city. Because the sewer collapsed, 3rd Street stayed dry longer than expected. And when the water finally came in, back up to that. So here we're looking at 3rd Street is flooded. And as water raises, you see this has been built up a little bit right here, and I'll talk about why that is later. But what would happen is you get backflow from Lawson's Run that would flood up through the east end and join with the flooded area of 3rd Street. So with 3rd Street remaining dry in 1897, when it finally flooded, the water came from the east. It came from 4th across Gay and Chillicothe, and then flooded 3rd. But at one point, the water was 3 feet lower on 3rd, or 3 feet lower in the sewer at 3rd, than it was on Front Street. And this got people thinking. A couple days after the flood, editorial in the Portsmouth Blade The accident to the 3rd Street sewer shows that floodgates in the sewers would prevent considerable damage and inconvenience in the event of a flood. A levee near Lawson's Run in the East End, and another north of the Norfolk and Western Freight Yard. So the old N&W Freight Yard was about where Penn Station is, by the viaduct on Scioto Trail. Another north of the Norfolk and Western Freight Yard, so Robinson Avenue in other words, would also prove effective. The combination of them would keep the water off 3rd Street in the north end. The gentleman who favored such improvements states the entire expense caused by such improvements would cost less than $5,000. The Daily Times was a lot more concise. Put a dike at Robinson Avenue and a floodgate in the 3rd Street sewer, and Portsmouth would be floodproof. Now, floodproof is an idea, I think, that has been chased since this time. You can never really make it floodproof, but I think at the present time, with the big 77-foot wall, we're as close as you can possibly be. So we get up to the next year, 1898, we have another flood, 57.5-foot crest, so just barely into the moderate flood range. The problem was that despite council having approved some of these improvements, the previous year, nothing had been done except for rebuilding the 3rd Street sewer with a floodgate. So when the water starts raising in 1898, the Times, which was extremely critical of the council, the Times at this time was a Democratic newspaper. The council was Republican, and the Blade was one of 2 Republican papers. And, you know, basically they all bickered at each other and blamed each other for everything, and things don't really change, do they? So the Times writes, it might have been a much wiser thing for council to have raised the dike on Boundary Street in the East End instead of raising salaries. The dike would have been much the cheapest, besides the people may need it badly. In the middle of the night, though, Democratic Mayor Charlie Glidden headed up what we might call a task force to erect emergency levees at 3 strategic places in town. One near the Burgess Mill at 3rd and Madison in the West End. Another on Campbell between 8th and the Railroad in the East End, and incidentally, that one is close to Glidden's house. And then there was another on, the newspaper reports say that it's on Waller in the North End, but it doesn't say where on Waller. It might have been as far south as 9th, because the North End did get flooded pretty badly. But I'm not entirely sure where that one was. So by erecting these temporary levees at 3rd and Madison and Campbell and 8th, that prevented this backwater from Lawson's Run spilling westward through the city. The flood valve in the 3rd Street sewer, the levee at 3rd and Madison, kept 3rd dry. And so really, you had some flooding of Front Street businesses, some flooding on 2nd Street nearer Alexandria Point, but the commercial heart of the city was really kept dry. And so the Democratic Daily Times and the Republican Daily Blade go at each other, trying to claim credit. The Times saying that the success attending the work done to keep the water out of the city is wholly due to Democratic Mayor Glidden, assisted by the fire department. The Blade, I guess, city engineer and Republican appointee Ben Bratt is not so slow an engineer after all. With the sewer valve he helped me at bay the Ohio flood tide. Times, how much more effective would have been this work had it been done last summer by council under the direction of a competent engineer. The Blade Republican councilman Joe Gratt, who I believe was engineer Ben Gratt's brother. Joe Gratt was instrumental in getting the valve for the 3rd Street sewer, thus saving a large part of the 1st Ward, the West End, Bonito, from the flood. Better councilman than Joe Gratt are hard to get, and the times little, if any, more expense would have been incurred for permanent improvements that has been spent for the temporary expedients resorted to in this emergency. The engineer and council are alone to blame for this waste of public money. Council raised salaries at a time when they were not able to raise Broadway Street. Next Monday, the people will raise, clever fun, the council beginning in the East End. So, you know, I don't know what the human instinct is to politicize everything, but it's definitely nothing new. Another interesting outcome of the 1898 flood is that people began moving to higher ground. You don't really see a big movement into the true hilltop, but this ad ran in the Blade. George Scudder, who is an attorney, had lots for sale on 3rd, 4th, 5th, and Gallia east of Offmere. So that's the vicinity of Rose Ridge that I pointed out. Also 6 lots on 6th and 2 lots on 11th on the line of the Street Railway. You will never get them again so cheap. 1901, we had a 58-foot crest, and there had been a flood commission formed by council after 1898. It had issued recommendations. Those recommendations had largely been followed, and so we now had a permanent levee in the East End on Broadway between 8th and the railroad. Let's not restart this now. So
Just be ready.
That's okay. I'll be ready around 12:30 tomorrow.
here we go. So the temporary levee had been built on Campbell. Permanent levee was built on Broadway. And that's why now this ground is higher than it was in the 19th century, because we're looking at the remains of this old permanent levee that was intended to keep Lawson's Run from back flooding the East End. Additionally, there were pumping stations on Jefferson at 3rd and at the foot of Jefferson on the Ohio riverfront, and flood valves have been added to sewers throughout the city. And so the city was thought to be protected against between 58 and 60 feet of water. In 1901, the flooded areas predictably included Front Street, Slabtown, and the southern part of Earlytown in the vicinity of Scott. The north end also flooded as far south as Tracy Park, and as far as the north end flooding, the attitude at this time was really not necessarily to keep water out of the city entirely, but to protect the commercial heart of the city. Moreover, the north end is historically the African American neighborhood, and so the sad truth is that they just didn't see it as important to protect it. So the north end flooded as far south as Tracy Park, which is, what, 9th Street? But because the commercial district remained above water, the Daily Times claimed it was a great success and pronounced the city unscathed. The experience of the past week has shown their entire utility and value in reference to the levies. The people now know what they are and and they have been unstinted in their praise of the Democratic administration and the magnificent work it did. They understand full well but for the dikes, the central portion of the city with its immense retail business would have been inundated and all manufacturing and trade practically paralyzed. We see now that they have in those dikes given us 100 times more than they spent. So we were feeling pretty good about things. And we get up to 1907, and 1907 is curious because we have not one but two floods that year. In January, the Ohio reached 61 feet, and 2 months later, nearly equaled it, getting to 60.8 feet. And the defenses really at most good 260 feet. So the city got flooded twice, and this is what finally drove a group of local businessmen to confront council with the need for more robust flood defenses. So on 20th of March, Frank Knaus, who was the head of the Portsmouth Stove Company, as well as a member of council, introduced the first floodwall legislation. This was put to the voters in the general election in November, and they approved it. And in March of 1908, the council authorized the issuance of bonds to pay for it. And so this is the creation of the 1909 floodwall. The plans for the first section of the wall were delivered by James and Bowden Hudson, who was the city engineer at the time. He delivered plans for a 62-foot wall, and when council approved it, and it's not clear to me why, but they only approved a 61-foot wall. That flood wall, a remnant of which is still freestanding in the far west end on Front Street. It extended along front for 6,600 feet. The western terminus actually wrapped around Alexandria Point, so the western terminus was at Scioto and 2nd Street, and the eastern terminus was on Chillicothe Street, a half block north of Front. So that was intended again to protect the commercial heart of the city, i.e. the west end. Earth and embankments were to be placed strategically along low points on Scioto River frontage. And I've got a couple maps to show you here. So these are the Sanborn Fire Insurance Company maps. These are really great resources. This is the map from 1911, sheet 5. This is in the west end, Front Street to 4th Street, Court to Chillicothe. And I'm going to zoom in here on the southeast corner. And across the bottom here, this line is marked as a cement retaining wall. That's the flood wall. It turns north on Chillicothe, and it ends right there. The school building that's shown here stands where the dog park is now. And if you ever wondered what this curious protuberance of concrete is underneath the Grant Bridge, that's the stump of the Chillicothe Street extension of the flood wall. Looking out into the far west end, there's a neat little thing going on here. So here I've got circled the Baltimore and Ohio switch yard. So this was about where the Valley Foods warehouse is, on Market and a kitty corner from St. Mary's. And you can see the roundhouse right there. And there were spur lines that ran to various manufacturing plants. So detail up top here along 4th Street. So the switch yard would have been up in the northeast corner of this map. And there was a railroad spur that ran down the center of 4th. The skate park today is right about here. And if you go down to the skate park, what you will find is on either side of 4th Street, 4th is actually raised, and you have these concrete walls. So this was part of the flood defense. They had to raise the street to run the track because trains don't like to go up and down on short distances. So that raised railroad bed became part of flood defense. So there we are with the Alexandria Point, Chillicothe Street, 61-foot flood wall, finished in 1909. And we get to 1913, and again, we have 2 floods. In mid-January, a 58-foot flood that the wall successfully defended against. And then at the end of March, a nearly 68-foot flood. Now, 68 feet obviously is going to blow clear past the 61-foot wall, but the really significant thing to recognize here is that the flood wall failed before it was overtopped. So this is the old Daily Times building, which stands about where Shawnee's Aquatic Center is. And here's that north stretch of the flood wall that ends abruptly after half a block. And you can see that the Ohio has risen and is just flowing around the end of it into the west end. So this was 3 days before the crest of the 13 flood. The flood wall wouldn't have stopped it, but it illustrated that it clearly was not good enough. So in 1915, the flood wall was raised to 62 feet, fulfilling Hudson's original plan and extending from Chillicothe Street on down to Othnier Street. That added another 3,800 feet at a cost of $135,000. And in 1928, it was finally extended all the way through the east end to join the N&W railroads levees that protected their yards. That added almost a mile in length, and that project was originally budgeted for $230,000. It almost didn't pass the public vote, but it did get approved. It ran over budget to $300,000, and then it ran over budget to $432,000. So by the time all is said and done, 2 decades of building a flood wall that was almost 3 miles in length. The city had spent $600,000. Additionally, there was perhaps $50,000 for pumping stations and sewer modifications. In 1936, there was still $316,000 outstanding on that. And just for comparison, the Portsmouth New Boston flood defense was built between 1940 and 1950, cost $10 million, the equivalent of about $135 million today. 2 floods in the 30s, 33 and 36, and I think these floods have been almost forgotten, and they're really, really important in the story of municipal flood defense, not just in Portsmouth, but in the United States. The 33 flood crested at 60.7 feet, and in this flood, we did see some minor flooding due to the Scioto backwater, but Importantly, the Ohio was held out, and the weak point in this was not Portsmouth's floodwall, it was the N&W levees, which were subsequently reinforced. So the cost of the 37 flood at Portsmouth was about $25,000. This was coal to run the pumping stations, sandbags to block the floodgates, and to shore up the N&W levees and pay for workers. The school board estimated that had the city flooded, it would have cost the schools alone $100,000. And this is because the schools in the lower parts of the city would have been damaged. The schools in the upper part of the city would have been refugee shelters. And so this would have been clearly very costly for the entire city. And this is the point at which people begin to refer to Portsmouth Floodwall as the $1 million floodwall. Not because it cost $1 million, but because it saved $1 million. Dubious advertisement from Penny's a couple days after the flood crested. Penny's is ready to flood the entire community with savings and gay dresses. Whatever. 36, not quite as high as the 33 flood, but still, Portsmouth was completely protected. And the headline in the Portsmouth Times, Floodwall saves city from a second $1 million loss. Visitors marvel at huge body of water several feet higher than street level. Here, they're citing the cost of the floodwall at $750,000. I'm not sure how they're arriving at that number. They do math differently than I do, I guess. But this, I think it was going on before this, but especially because of this, other cities began sending delegations to Portsmouth to inspect the flood wall. And I guess it became a form of disaster tourism almost. The 36 flood was a catastrophic flood on the Ohio River. So was 33. To this day, the 36 is still the worst year in Pittsburgh. Editorial in the Portsmouth Times on the 29th. Impressed by the success of the flood wall, a situation many could not conceive until they actually saw it. A number of other river cities have already begun movements to erect similar defenses. Portsmouth, alone among cities on the 470-mile course of the Ohio between Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, remain untouched by the flood, has become the marvel of every river city from the Mississippi to New England. And it's co-backers that has the dubious taste headline in this flood. The flood wall and co-backers. One protects you against high water, the other against high prices. They don't have any gay dresses. So after the 36 flood, there was a group of civic business leaders that had been publishing an occasional series in the Times called something like "How Well Do You Know Portsmouth?" and highlighting different industries. And then one of these highlighted Floodwall. These were all collected into a bound volume that was published later in the year. But the center spread of this volume was this: Portsmouth, the protected city. And we've got headlines from the New York newspapers here about how Portsmouth's flood wall held out the Ohio River. We've got some dramatic photographs here where you can see that hard line of the wall holding back the Ohio. We've got a map that shows the parts of the city that would be flooded at different stages, similar to the Google Earth images that I showed you earlier. And then the pictures here everybody going about their business on Lower Chillicothe Street and Front Street, while the water is, you know, a couple feet below the top of the flood wall. So this is actually, this picture at the top left, or excuse me, top right, is the foot of the Grant Bridge looking north. See the sign of the Hotel Earth right there, and there's the Cricket building right there. So Portsmouth was the only city on the Upper Ohio to withstand the floods in 33 and 36. And as I mentioned, 36 is still the worst flood on record in Pittsburgh. These were very costly floods to these other cities, and it was thought basically that it was futile to try to build a wall that could keep out something like the Ohio River. As I said, Portsmouth began hosting these delegations from other cities. But the important thing is that Portsmouth's flood wall, as the first flood wall, as a municipally conceived, municipally funded, and municipally constructed flood defense, it provided proof of concept that you could defend against an Ohio River flood. Following the 36 flood, representatives from Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky began agitating in Congress for a federally funded system of flood control reservoirs on the major tributaries of the Ohio. I believe there were supposed to, in the initial plan, there were supposed to be 6 on the Muskingum and 4 on the Scioto. But the real kicker is after the 36 flood, because you had 33 and 36 coming so close together, there was also a disastrous flood in the lower Mississippi in 1927. Congress finally came to believe that flood control was federal responsibility. Before this, Congress had occasionally charged the Army Corps of Engineers with flood control projects, but they were really centered around navigation and fairly local in scope. But in mid-36, Congress passed the Flood Control Act, which Roosevelt signed on the 22nd of June. And then we get to 1937. So the 37 flood obliterated the previous records. 1913 had gone to about 68 feet, and 1937 went 6 feet over that. Only 10 months after Portsmouth's $1 million flood wall was celebrated. This put 63% of Portsmouth underwater, shut down every manufacturing plant and almost every store, rendered 80% of the population refugees. Portsmouth was hit harder than any other city in Ohio. In terms of monetary damages, Portsmouth had an estimated $16 million in damages. Cincinnati had $15 million, but Cincinnati was also 10 times larger than Portsmouth. But because of the Flood Control Act, and because of the Army Corps of Engineers' charge under the Flood Control Act, they began building flood defenses around strategic Ohio River cities. And I honestly believe that they would not have done this if it had not been for the success of Portsmouth flood defenses in 33 and 36. As near as I can tell, the Corps just decided that you look at what the crest of what the 37 flood was in each city and add 3 feet to it. And that's how they decided how tall to build them. So we got a 77.25 foot flood wall out of it. The Portsmouth Boston flood defense in total is 8.1 miles long. It's 4 miles of concrete walls and 4.1 miles of earthen levees. And ground was broken on 25th of June, 1940. 1940. Construction was paused in 1942 because of World War II, and it would be 1950 before it was complete. But between 37 and 50, the Ohio River at Portsmouth rose above moderate flood stage 5 more times. And 2 of them, in 45 and 48, were higher than the old Floodwall. And 45, I think, is the great unknown Portsmouth story. The newspaper called it the Battle of the Floodwall. With the river rising, there was an unfinished section in the east end, and they called for volunteers to sandbag it. 2,000 people showed up. And there's a brilliant photograph in the Daily Times of an Army cargo plane coming in low over the rail yards and dropping a bale of canvas bags to use as sandbags. You got to figure, this is 1945, this is the end of World War II. Everybody's tired. You know, every town in America is war weary, and 2,000 people showed up to hold out the Ohio River successfully. Incomplete flood defense. So, just to quickly bring it to an end here, I'm very grateful to have had a sabbatical this past spring, which gave me 4 months in the basement of the library reading ancient newspapers in the Center for Public History. I'd like to thank Drew Feit, who answered a lot of obscure questions, like, you know, where's the honey nut? He doesn't know. I think maybe I know, but I'm not really sure either. Where's Slabtown? So I'm very appreciative to him. Also, Wesley Vanderweg, who is the Ohio History Service Corps volunteer in the Center for Public History. Diane Ratliff, Portsmouth City Clerk, opened up her office to me for several weeks to read ancient city council minutes in the local history department at the Portsmouth Library. Photograph here from Portsmouth Public Library collection. This is 1940, the river at 59 feet. And this guy's face says it all. Just looks sick, like it's happening again. So, that's what I know.
Right. I have a question.
Yes.
So in your research, did you come across any kind of a discussion or debate about after some of these catastrophic floods, is it smart to rebuild where we are? Is it, or was it just presumed that like we're going to stick with the boundaries of the city as we know it and just do the best to protect them?
Maybe the closest those discussions ever came was after 37. But enough infrastructure was able to be restored quickly enough that it became. I think you go back into the 19th century and these events were viewed as acts of God, they're trials, and good Protestant approach is to withstand it and rebuild in place. But no, the history of Portsmouth really begins with Alexandria. And Alexandria was abandoned because Alexandria is low ground. And Portsmouth, I think, just by virtue of the fact that Portsmouth usually was safe when Alexandria was underwater literally every other year. And the attitude was, this is as good as a place as we're going to have. Especially once you open up the hilltop, too. The hilltop really is flood-proof, unless you're talking about urban storm flash flooding.
Thank you.
I have a lot of like little questions that are annoying. I am curious, like, I'm sure that other changes on the Ohio River have happened since that 37 flood, because we've not seen those levels ever since then, right?
Not even close. And part of that is because
They have like those reservoirs and stuff.
the reservoir project and all the dams that are built on the Ohio, flood control isn't just flood defense anymore, it's flood prevention.
Yeah, yeah. Are we, as far as like climate change and preparations, how is our infrastructure holding? We have to rebuild stuff? Is it gonna get drier in this part of the world? I mean, there's some
I think it's gonna get
speculation.
wetter.
What's that?
I think it's going to get wetter.
It's
You
gonna
know,
get wetter.
the fact that we didn't get hit with remnant moisture from a hurricane, we got hit with active moisture from a hurricane 2 weeks ago. I think that tells us that it's going to get wetter in this part of the world. But you know, I also think that we are very well defended now. The prevention infrastructure is designed in such a way that you can take one of those reservoirs offline and do repairs to it. And some of them have been repaired in the intervening 75 years. As long as you've got a Congress that's willing to put up the money to do that. And every presidential election since I've been an adult, very early on in the election cycle, you have candidates talking about we need funding to support infrastructure. And by the time you get up to the election, the remaining candidates aren't talking about that anymore. And America's infrastructure is crumbling. I'm not concerned about our flood wall crumbling at this point, but there's other things that are definitely problematic. And given time, this could become problematic too.
Flash flooding, is that because the drainage was insufficient, or is there just too much moisture for the drainage to handle it?
My belief is that the storm sewers, so what happened in the Hilltop? The storm sewers on Grandview and High and Summit were built when those neighborhoods were developed in the 30s and early 40s. And there wasn't anything at higher elevations than that. But then you put SOMC up there and you paved everything on that section of the Hilltop. Now you don't have any infiltration and you're trying to funnel all of that water into tiny storm sewers. That's the problem. The city needs all new sewers.
That'll be fun.
And then, you know, as far as our parking lot here, that's the, you know, second lowest point in the city.
That's gonna flood every
That's going to flood every time.
Yeah.
You know, there should be no surprises there.
If we're expecting a lot of rainfall, we just need to tell people to move your cars to that lot by the library.
All right, thank you very much.
An hour on the nose.
Perfect. See, you don't need a clock. You got an internal clock.